The key would not turn, and Edmund Ashworth was ready to break the door down with his own hands. He had waited 3 weeks for this moment, ever since his solicitor sent word that the sale of the old bookshop on Wren Lane had finally closed. Now the brass key was jammed in a lock that had not been oiled in years, and rain was falling in cold sheets across his shoulders. He pushed his weight against the door, twisted the key one more time, and felt the lock give way with a groan that sounded almost like relief. The smell hit him first. Dust, old paper, and something faintly sweet, like dried flowers left too long in a drawer. Edmund stepped inside and pulled the door shut behind him, shutting out the storm. For a moment he simply stood there, dripping onto the wooden floor, staring at shelves that climbed all the way to the ceiling, every one of them packed with forgotten books. He had not bought this place because he needed it. A duke had no real use for a failing bookshop in a quiet corner of London, far from his estates and far from the world that expected so much of him. He had bought it because the auction notice had caught his eye on a morning when nothing else in his life felt worth doing, and because something about the crooked painted sign outside, faded letters spelling out Whitfield and Sons, had stopped his breath in his chest. He did not know a family named Whitfield had once owned this shop until the solicitor mentioned it in passing. By then the sale was already done, and it was too late to ask why his hand had trembled when he signed the papers. Edmund moved deeper into the shop, past shelves that sagged under decades of dust, past a reading desk with a cracked leather chair still pushed beneath it, as if someone had only just stepped away. He ran his fingers along the spines of books nobody had touched in years. Everything here felt frozen, waiting. He was not a man who believed in ghosts, but the shop felt haunted all the same, not by anything cruel, by absence, by the shape of a life that had once filled this space and then vanished from it entirely. At the back of the shop, behind a curtain gone stiff with age, he found a smaller room that must have once served as an office. A narrow window let in gray light from the alley outside. A writing desk stood against the far wall, its surface scarred with ink stains, and above it, a single shelf held nothing but empty jars and a broken candle holder. Edmund reached out to touch the desk, and that was when he noticed the panel. It sat low on the wall beside the desk, slightly out of line with the wood around it, as though it had been pried loose once and never properly fixed back into place. He knelt down and pressed his fingers against the edge. It gave way easily, swinging open to reveal a narrow gap between the wall and the room beyond it. Inside, wrapped in a strip of faded ribbon, was a single folded letter. His hands went still. He told himself it was nothing, some forgotten bill or a note between long-dead tenants, the kind of thing every old building held in its bones. But when he lifted it free of the ribbon and turned it toward the window's gray light, his heart stopped inside his chest. He knew that handwriting. He had spent years trying to forget it, the careful slant of every letter, the way she crossed her T's with a small flourish at the end, as if she could not help but make even the plainest words look like poetry. He had seen that handwriting on notes slipped beneath his door, on the last page of a book she had once pressed into his hands and told him to keep forever. Eleanor. Edmund had not spoken her name aloud in years. He had not allowed himself to. There had been a time when saying her name felt like reopening a wound that refused to close, and so he had simply stopped, buried her memory beneath duty and silence, and the slow gray years that followed her disappearance from his life. He unfolded the letter with hands that were no longer steady. The paper was thin and yellowed, the ink faded in places, but her words were still legible enough to read. He had only gotten as far as the first line, a single sentence that made his breath catch somewhere between his ribs, when a voice behind him made him nearly drop the page entirely. "You are not supposed to be back here." Edmund turned so quickly he struck his shoulder against the edge of the desk. An older woman stood in the doorway of the small room, wrapped in a shawl the color of dried moss, her white hair pinned back beneath a faded cap. She held a lantern in one hand, though there was still enough daylight to see by, and her eyes, sharp despite her age, moved from his face to the letter clutched in his hand. "I own this shop now," Edmund said, though his voice came out rougher than he intended. "I have every right to be back here." The woman studied him a moment longer, then set her lantern down on the edge of the desk with the careful movements of someone who had lived a long time and learned not to waste effort on anything unnecessary. "I am Mrs. Pemberton," she said. "I kept this place clean for the family that lived here before it closed its doors. Nobody told me a new owner had come. I still have my own key, you see. Force of habit, I suppose, coming back to check on an empty building." Edmund glanced down at the letter in his hand, then back at her. Something in the way she had looked at the page told him she already knew more than she was saying. "Do you know this handwriting?" he asked. Mrs. Pemberton's expression did not change. but something behind her eyes shifted, like a door easing open just a crack. "That depends," she said quietly, "on why a duke is standing in the back room of an empty shop, reading letters that are none of his business, with his hands shaking like a man who has seen something he never expected to see again." Edmund felt heat rise up the back of his neck. He was not used to being read so plainly, not by strangers, not by anyone. Most people who spoke to him weighed every word, careful of his title, careful of his position. This woman spoke to him as though he were nothing more than a curious young man who had wandered somewhere he should not be. "Her name was Eleanor," he said finally, because there seemed no point in pretending otherwise. "Eleanor Whitfield. I knew her once, a long time ago." The lantern light flickered against Mrs. Pemberton's face, and for a moment she looked almost sad. "Whitfield," she repeated softly. "Yes, I remember a young woman by that name. She worked in this very room for a season, years back, quiet as anything, kept mostly to herself, though I always thought there was a great sadness sitting behind her eyes, the kind that comes from loving someone you cannot have." Edmund's chest tightened. What happened to her? Where did she go? Mrs. Pemberton was quiet for a long moment, long enough that the rain outside seemed to grow louder, drumming against the windows like something impatient to be let in. "That," she said finally, "is a longer story than I have time to tell you tonight, but I will say this much. Whatever you found in that letter, young man, it was not meant to stay hidden forever. She left it for a reason, and now that you have found it, I suspect you will not rest until you understand why." Edmund looked down at the letter again, at the words he had not yet finished reading, and felt something shift inside his chest that he had not felt in years. Not grief, exactly, though grief was there too, buried deep beneath years of careful distance. This felt more like hope, fragile and unfamiliar, the kind of feeling he had trained himself long ago to stop expecting. "Will you tell me what you remember?" he asked. "Whatever it is, I need to know." Mrs. Pemberton studied him for a long moment, as though weighing whether he could be trusted with whatever truth she carried. Finally she nodded, slow and deliberate, and reached for her lantern. "Not tonight," she said. "The light is going, and this is not a story for shadows. Come back tomorrow, when the sun is up, and bring patience with you. Some stories cannot be rushed, and this one, I think, has waited long enough already." She moved toward the door, pausing only once to glance back at him over her shoulder. "Whatever you do," she added, "do not read the rest of that letter alone tonight. Whatever is written there, it deserves more than an empty room and a storm outside the window." Edmund watched her go, listened to her footsteps fade toward the front of the shop, and then the soft click of the door closing behind her. He stood alone in the small back room, rain still falling outside, the letter trembling faintly in his hand. He knew he should heed her warning. He knew he should wait. But his eyes had already dropped back down to the page, to the words written in a hand he had once known better than his own, and he found he could not look away. The first line alone had already undone years of careful discipline. If she had written those words expecting no one would ever read them, then whatever followed might undo him entirely. And yet some part of him, the part that had spent years pretending he no longer thought of her, needed to know what she had left behind more than he needed his own composure. He carried the letter to the window, where the last gray light of the storm still reached the desk, and told himself he would read only one more line, only one, and then he would fold it away and wait for morning as Mrs. Pemberton had asked. But even as he thought it, he knew it was a lie he was telling only himself. Outside, the rain had begun to ease, softening from a hard drumming to a gentler patter against the glass. Somewhere beyond the shop, London carried on as it always did, carriages moving through wet streets, lamplighters beginning their evening rounds, a city entirely unaware that inside a small forgotten bookshop, a duke stood frozen over a letter that had waited years to be found. Edmund thought of the years since Eleanor had disappeared from his life. He thought of the quiet, orderly existence he had built in her absence, the estates he managed, the obligations he fulfilled without complaint, the careful distance he kept from anyone who might ask him to feel something he had long ago decided was too dangerous to feel again. He had told himself that distance was peace. Standing here now, letter trembling in his hand, he understood for the first time how much of a lie that had always been. He thought, too, of Mrs. Pemberton's warning, and of the strange certainty in her voice when she said the letter had been left for a reason. If that was true, then Eleanor had wanted this moment to happen, even if she had never imagined it would take so many years to arrive. The thought steadied something in him, even as it opened a door he was not sure he was ready to walk through. He looked down at the page one final time, at the ink faded but still legible after so many years hidden behind a broken panel in a forgotten room. Whatever waited in the rest of those words, he no longer had any wish to turn away from it. He had spent enough years turning away. Slowly, carefully, as though the paper itself might crumble beneath his hands, Edmund folded the letter along its original crease and slipped it into the inner pocket of his coat, close against his chest. He would not read further tonight. Not because Mrs. Pemberton had asked him to wait, though her warning had settled somewhere deep in his mind and refused to be ignored, but because some quiet instinct told him this letter deserved more than a hurried reading in a cold, empty room with rain still tapping against the glass. Tomorrow, he decided. Tomorrow, in the daylight, he would return, and Mrs. Pemberton would tell him whatever she remembered, and together the pieces of a story he thought had ended long ago might finally begin to make sense. He glanced once more around the small back room before he left, at the writing desk scarred with years of ink, at the broken panel still hanging open in the wall, at the space where a young woman named Eleanor Whitfield had once sat and written words she never expected anyone to find. Then he stepped back through the curtain, locked the shop's stubborn door behind him as best the old lock allowed, and walked out into the rain with a single thought circling through his mind, refusing to let him go. She had left something behind for him to find, and after all these years he had finally found it. Edmund did not sleep that night. He sat in the chair by his study window with the letter unopened on the small table beside him, watching the candle burn lower and lower, telling himself again and again that he would wait until morning as he had promised. The temptation to break that promise pulled at him every hour, but something in Mrs. Pemberton's voice, some quiet warning she had left hanging in the air of that small back room, kept his hands still. By the time the sun rose over London, pale and thin through a sky still heavy with clouds from the storm, Edmund had already dressed and called for his carriage. He arrived at the bookshop on Wren Lane before the street had properly woken, and found Mrs. Pemberton already waiting for him at the door, a shawl wrapped tight around her shoulders, and 2 cups of tea balanced on a small tray. "You look like a man who did not sleep," she said, stepping aside to let him in. "I did not," Edmund admitted. "Good," she said simply, and led him toward the back of the shop. "A story like this one should cost you something. Sit." They settled into the small back room, the same room where he had found the letter the night before. Mrs. Pemberton lowered herself into the cracked leather chair behind the writing desk, setting the tea tray between them, with the careful precision of someone used to small rituals that steadied the mind before difficult conversations. "I knew the Whitfield family for many years," she began. "Good people. Honest, hard-working, the kind who never asked for more than what their labor earned them. The father ran this shop for most of his life, and his daughter grew up among these shelves, reading every book twice before she was old enough to reach the top rows without a stool." "Eleanor," Edmund said quietly. "Eleanor," Mrs. Pemberton agreed. "A bright girl, too bright, some might have said, for a life spent quietly selling books in a small shop, but she never complained of it, not until the year everything changed." Edmund leaned forward, his tea forgotten. "What happened?" Mrs. Pemberton was quiet for a moment, her eyes distant, as though she were looking through the walls of the shop into a memory only she could see. "She fell in love," she said finally. "Deeply, foolishly, the way only the very young manage to love, without any thought for consequence. I did not know the man's name back then. She never spoke it aloud to me, not once, though I could see it written all over her whenever she thought no one was watching. She would sit at this very desk in the evenings, writing letters she never sent, smiling at words only she could read." Edmund's chest tightened. He thought of all the letters he had once written to Eleanor himself, folded and sealed and delivered by hand under cover of darkness, so that no one in his father's household would discover the truth of where his affections had settled. "But something happened to end it," he said. It was not a question. "Something always happens to end it, for girls like Eleanor," Mrs. Pemberton said, and there was an old bitterness in her voice, worn smooth by years but not gone entirely. One day she simply stopped smiling. She stopped writing her letters. She grew quiet, in a way that frightened me. Quiet the way a house grows quiet after someone has died inside it. I asked her once what had happened. She told me only that the man she loved had chosen duty over her, and that she would not trouble me with the details. Edmund felt something cold settle in his stomach. He knew exactly what duty Mrs. Pemberton meant, because he remembered it far too well. His father, furious at the discovery of his son's attachment to a shopkeeper's daughter, had arranged a match with a family of far greater standing. Before Edmund had any chance to protest, he remembered the arguments, the threats, the cold fury in his father's eyes, when Edmund tried to explain that he loved someone his father considered beneath him. He remembered, too, his own silence in the weeks that followed, the way he had let his father's will overpower his own because he did not yet understand how to fight for what mattered against a man who controlled every part of his future. He had told himself, all those years ago, that he would find a way to make things right once the pressure eased. He had told himself there would be time. There had not been time. By the time his father's arranged match fell apart on its own, months later, for reasons that had nothing to do with Edmund at all, Eleanor was already gone. He had gone looking for her then, quietly, carefully, avoiding any scandal that might reach his father's ears. He had found this shop closed, the family vanished, no forwarding address left behind for a man who had never even given her a proper explanation for his silence. "I searched for her," Edmund said quietly, more to himself than to Mrs. Pemberton. "After my father's match collapsed, I searched everywhere I could think to look. I never found so much as a trace." Mrs. Pemberton studied him with new interest, as though his words had confirmed something she had only suspected until now. "So it was you," she said. "You were the man." Edmund did not answer, because there was no need to. His silence was answer enough. "She never told me your name," Mrs. Pemberton continued, "but she told me enough to know that whoever he was, she believed he had chosen his family's expectations over her. She believed he had simply walked away, the way men of his standing so often do when love becomes inconvenient to their position. It broke something in her, watching him choose duty without so much as a word of explanation. "I never chose to leave her," Edmund said, his voice rougher than he intended. "My father forced my hand. I was young, and I did not yet understand how to stand against him. I have regretted my silence every day since, but I did not abandon her by choice." Mrs. Pemberton's expression softened slightly, though there was still caution behind her eyes. "That may well be true, but the truth you know and the truth she believed are two very different things, and only one of them shaped the rest of her life." Edmund sat back, his mind spinning through years of quiet regret, all of it suddenly reframed by a single devastating realization. Eleanor had not simply drifted away from him. She had believed, for years, that he had chosen someone else, that he had walked away from her without a second thought, when in truth he had spent those same years buried in silent grief, searching for a woman he could never find. "The letter," he said suddenly, remembering the folded page still resting in his coat pocket. "What does it say? Have you read it?" "I have not," Mrs. Pemberton said. "It was not mine to read, but I remember the day she hid it. I found her back here, tears on her face, tucking something behind that loose panel in the wall. When I asked what she was doing, she told me she was leaving something behind, in case the man she loved ever came looking for the truth. She said if he cared enough to search, he deserved to find it. And if he never came, then at least the truth would remain here, waiting, even after she was long gone from this place." Edmund's hands trembled as he drew the letter from his coat. He had read only the first line the night before, a single sentence that had stopped his breath entirely. Now, with Mrs. Pemberton watching quietly across the small desk, he unfolded the page fully and began to read. The words were simple, unadorned, written by a young woman who had clearly poured every ounce of her heart into the page, without any expectation that gentleness would soften what she had to say. She wrote of love that had felt certain and unshakable, of promises made beneath a chestnut tree behind her father's shop, of a future she had allowed herself to imagine in careless, hopeful detail. She wrote, too, of the day the promises stopped, the silence that followed, and the slow, painful understanding that the man she loved had chosen his family's expectations over the life they had planned together. But near the bottom of the page, her tone shifted. She wrote that despite everything, despite the pain and the years that would surely separate them, she could not bring herself to hate him entirely. She wrote that some small, foolish part of her still hoped that one day, if fate allowed it, he might come looking for the truth she had left behind. And if he did, she wanted him to know one final thing. "There is a second letter," she had written, "waiting somewhere only you would think to look. If you remember us at all, you will know where to find it." Edmund looked up from the page, his eyes burning, his chest tight with a grief he had carried silently for years finally breaking open into something rawer and more urgent than sorrow alone. "A second letter," he said. "She left a second letter somewhere. Somewhere only I would know to look." Mrs. Pemberton watched him carefully, her expression unreadable. "Do you know where that might be?" Edmund thought back through years of memory, through every place he and Eleanor had once shared in secret, away from prying eyes and disapproving fathers. A chestnut tree behind her father's shop, she had written, but there had been other places too, quieter places, places that had meant something only to the two of them. "I might," he said slowly. "There is a place." If I am right, it will take me somewhere I have not returned to in years. Then I suggest, Mrs. Pemberton said, rising from her chair and gathering the tea tray with brisk, practical movements, that you go there before the trail grows any colder than it already has. Grief has a way of making people careless with the truth, young man, and you have already lost enough years to carelessness. Edmund folded the letter carefully and rose to his feet, a new sense of purpose settling over him, for the first time in longer than he could remember. He thanked Mrs. Pemberton, promised to return with whatever he found, and stepped back out into the London morning with the first true hope he had felt in years, burning steadily in his chest. Somewhere in this city, or perhaps beyond it, a second letter was waiting. And after everything he had learned this morning, Edmund intended to find it, no matter how long the search took, or how far it led him from the quiet, careful life he had built in Eleanor's absence. He walked several streets before he even thought to call for his carriage, his mind too full of memory to notice the damp pavement or the vendors calling out their morning wares. The place he had in mind was not the chestnut tree Eleanor had mentioned in her letter, for that tree had stood behind her father's old shop, and the shop no longer belonged to anyone he could ask. But there was another place, quieter and further from prying eyes, where the two of them had once spent hours simply talking, away from the world that would never have approved of them together. It was a small garden behind a chapel on the edge of the city, half forgotten even in its own time, tended by an old gardener who asked no questions of the young couples who occasionally wandered through its gates. Edmund and Eleanor had gone there often in the final months before his father discovered their attachment, sitting beneath a stone archway wound thick with ivy, speaking of futures neither of them ever got to see. He wondered, walking toward it now, whether the garden still existed at all. So many years had passed. So much of the city he remembered from his youth had already changed beyond recognition. Old buildings torn down and replaced, familiar streets renamed and rerouted, until a man could walk through his own childhood and barely recognize a single corner of it. But some part of him needed to believe the garden was still there. He needed to believe that something from those months of quiet happiness had survived the years, the same way the letter had survived hidden behind a broken panel, waiting patiently for someone to finally come looking. As he walked, his thoughts returned again and again to his father, dead now these past 6 years, and to the choice that had shaped everything that followed. Edmund had spent so long telling himself that his father's will had simply been too powerful to resist, that a young man of 19 could not have stood against a duke's fury without losing everything that mattered to his family's future. But standing here now, with Eleanor's words still echoing through his mind, he found that excuse harder to accept than it had ever been before. He could have written to her. He could have found some way, however small, to explain the truth of what was happening, rather than simply falling silent and letting her draw her own conclusions. He had been afraid, he realized now, not only of his father's anger but of his own uncertainty, of not knowing how to fight for something his family had already decided he could not have. And in his fear, he had let Eleanor believe the worst of him, had let her carry that belief through years of silence that need never have happened at all. The weight of that realization settled heavily in his chest as he reached the edge of the old chapel grounds, half expecting to find the garden gone entirely, swallowed up by newer buildings the way so much else in the city had been. But there, beyond a low iron gate gone rust-colored with age, the garden still stood. Smaller than he remembered, and more overgrown, but unmistakably the same place, the stone archway still standing beneath a tangle of ivy, grown thick and wild over the years since anyone had last tended it with real care. Edmund pushed open the gate and stepped inside, his heart beating faster than the short walk could account for. He moved toward the archway slowly, memory guiding his steps more than sight, and knelt beside the base of the old stone where he and Eleanor had once carved their initials into the soft rock, believing themselves clever and hidden from the world. The initials were still there, faded by weather but visible if a person knew exactly where to look. And beside them, tucked into a small gap between two stones that had once served as their secret hiding place for shared notes and stolen apples during long afternoons together, Edmund's fingers found something small and solid, wrapped tightly in oilskin to protect it from the years of rain and cold it must have endured. His hands were shaking again as he drew it free. The oilskin package was smaller than Edmund expected, hardly larger than his palm, and impossibly light for something that had waited so many years to be found. He carried it back to his carriage without opening it, gripping it so tightly his knuckles turned pale against the leather seat as the horses pulled him home through crowded morning streets. Every instinct told him to tear the wrapping open right there in the garden, but some deeper caution held him back, the same caution that had kept him from reading the first letter alone in a storm the night before. Whatever waited inside deserved a steadier hand than the one shaking in his lap. Once inside his study, door locked against interruption, Edmund finally unwrapped the oilskin covering and found not a letter at all, but a small wooden box, no larger than a jewelry case, its surface carved with a pattern of ivy leaves that matched the archway where he had found it. He recognized the carving instantly. He had commissioned it himself, years ago, from a craftsman near the docks, and given it to Eleanor as a token during the last happy weeks before everything between them fell apart. He had forgotten he ever gave her such a thing. Or perhaps he had simply chosen not to remember, the way he had chosen not to remember so much else about those months, because remembering hurt too deeply to bear alongside the rest of his obligations. Inside the box, folded twice and tied with a thin strip of faded blue ribbon, was the second letter. Edmund untied the ribbon with careful fingers and unfolded the page, and found himself reading words even more raw than the first letter had contained. This one, it seemed, had been written later, after enough time had passed for grief to curdle into something closer to anger, though even the anger in her words was tempered by a sorrow that ached through every line. She wrote of the months following his silence, of the whispers that had followed her through the small streets near her father's shop once word spread that a duke's son had once been seen calling on her. Whispers that painted her as foolish for ever believing a man of his standing could have loved her honestly. She wrote of her father's failing health, worsened by worry and by debts that mounted faster than the shop could ever hope to repay. Debts that had begun, she believed, the very season Edmund stopped calling, as though some unseen hand had begun tightening its grip the moment their attachment ended. Edmund's stomach turned cold as he read further. He had never known about the debts. He had never known her father's health had suffered, or that the whispers following their broken attachment had followed her so cruelly through streets that should have offered her nothing but safety. Near the end of the page, her handwriting grew smaller, tighter, as though she were forcing the words out through some great effort of will. "We lost the shop within the year," she had written. "I do not blame you for the debts, not entirely, though I confess there were nights I searched for someone to blame simply because the alternative, believing that misfortune alone had destroyed everything my father built, felt too heavy to carry alone. I am writing this not to wound you, if you are ever fortunate enough, or unfortunate enough, to read it. I am writing it because I need someone, someday, to know the truth of what happened after you disappeared from my life. Perhaps that is selfish of me. Perhaps I no longer care whether it is selfish or not." Edmund set the letter down on his desk and pressed both hands over his face, breathing slowly through a grief that felt sharper now than anything he had experienced even in the earliest days after losing her. He had spent years imagining Eleanor safe somewhere, perhaps unhappy, perhaps still carrying some quiet resentment toward him, but safe nonetheless, free from the kind of hardship that letter described in such plain, devastating detail. He had never imagined debts, or a failing father, or whispers that followed her through streets that should have protected her. He had never imagined that his silence, however unintentional, might have contributed to a chain of misfortune that cost her everything her family had built. He read the letter twice more before he trusted himself to move again, searching every line for some clue as to where she might have gone once the shop was lost, but the page offered nothing further. Only grief laid bare, and a hope, faint but present in her final lines, that truth might someday find its way to him, regardless of how much time had passed. Edmund spent the following days in quiet, methodical searching. He returned to the bookshop each morning, working alongside Mrs. Pemberton to sort through old records and correspondence left behind by the previous tenants, hoping some scrap of paper might reveal where the Whitfield family had gone after losing their home. He visited solicitors' offices and searched old parish records, following every faint thread he could find, though most led nowhere at all. Mrs. Pemberton proved an invaluable guide through this search, her memory sharper than most records could manage, recalling names and dates with a precision that surprised him each time she offered some new detail he had not thought to ask about. She remembered, for instance, that Eleanor had a younger sister, a girl named Charlotte, though Mrs. Pemberton had never known the family well enough to say where either of them might have settled after the shop closed its doors. "A sister," Edmund repeated, sitting across from Mrs. Pemberton in the small back room that had become, over the course of these searching days, something like a second study to him. "You never mentioned a sister before." "You never asked," Mrs. Pemberton said simply, though there was a faint apology in her tone. "Charlotte was younger, perhaps by 5 or 6 years, and rarely came into the shop itself. I remember her mostly from a distance, a quiet girl who preferred her mother's company to the noise of customers and books. I could not tell you where she is now, if she is even still in London at all. It was on the 5th day of searching, as rain once again threatened outside the shop's narrow windows, that fortune finally turned in Edmund's favor. He had been going through a box of old shop ledgers, hoping some record of debt or supplier correspondence might mention a forwarding address, when the front bell above the shop door rang out unexpectedly, sharp and startling in the quiet. Mrs. Pemberton went to investigate, and Edmund heard voices from the front of the shop, low and unfamiliar. A woman's voice asking careful, guarded questions he could not quite make out from the back room. He set down the ledger and moved toward the curtain separating the two spaces, curiosity pulling him forward despite Mrs. Pemberton's earlier insistence that he continue his search undisturbed. He pushed the curtain aside just as Mrs. Pemberton turned toward him, an expression on her face he had not seen there before, something between caution and disbelief. "Edmund," she said carefully, using his given name for the first time since they had met, as though the formality of his title no longer fit the moment. "There is someone here you should meet." Standing near the front counter, wrapped in a traveling cloak still damp from the weather outside, was a woman perhaps 30 years of age, her dark hair pinned beneath a plain bonnet, her eyes sharp and assessing as they moved over Edmund with open suspicion. She carried herself with a stiffness that suggested she had rehearsed whatever she intended to say long before arriving and had not yet decided whether the man standing before her deserved to hear it. "You are the new owner," she said, before Edmund could offer any greeting of his own. It was not a question. "I am," Edmund said carefully. "Edmund Ashworth. And you are?" The woman's jaw tightened slightly, and for a moment Edmund thought she might turn and leave without answering at all. But something in her expression shifted, some private decision made behind her guarded eyes, and she drew herself up straighter before speaking. "Charlotte Colton," she said. "Though I was born Charlotte Whitfield, I believe you knew my sister." The room seemed to tilt slightly around him. Edmund reached out to steady himself against the edge of the counter, aware suddenly of Mrs. Pemberton watching him with quiet, careful attention, aware of the years of searching that had finally, impossibly, led someone directly to his door instead of the other way around. "Eleanor," he said, her name catching rough in his throat. "You are Eleanor's sister." "I am," Charlotte said, and something flickered across her face, quick and complicated, gone before Edmund could name it. "I heard, through channels I would rather not explain, that a duke had purchased my family's old shop and had been asking questions about our history all across the city. I came to find out why, and I will tell you plainly, sir, that if your intentions here are anything less than honorable, I would rather you close this shop and leave my family's memory buried where it belongs." Edmund straightened, meeting her guarded gaze directly despite the storm of emotion still churning through his chest. "My intentions could not be more honorable, I promise you. I loved your sister. I have never stopped searching for some way to make right what my silence cost her, though I did not understand the full weight of that cost until very recently." Charlotte's eyes narrowed slightly, studying him with the same careful assessment she had used since walking through the door. "Many men say such things when it suits them. Words cost nothing, your grace. My sister paid a far higher price than words for whatever affection once passed between the two of you." "I know that now," Edmund said quietly. "I have read her letters, both of them. I know what my silence cost your family, and I would give a great deal to undo it, though I understand that undoing it is likely impossible after so many years." Something in his voice seemed to reach her in a way his earlier words had not. Charlotte's posture eased, only slightly, though her expression remained guarded. "You found the letters," she said, more to herself than to him. "I did not think anyone ever would. Eleanor hid them so carefully, back when the shop still belonged to us, that I assumed they were lost forever once we sold the building and moved away." "Where is she now?" Edmund asked, unable to keep the urgency from his voice any longer. "Please, Charlotte. If you know where your sister is, I am begging you to tell me. I have spent years believing she simply vanished, unreachable, gone from my life entirely. If there is any chance of finding her, of explaining the truth she never had the chance to hear, I cannot let that chance pass me by." Charlotte studied him a long moment, her expression unreadable, and Edmund could see the careful calculation happening behind her eyes, weighing his sincerity against whatever protective instinct had brought her here in the first place. "My sister is alive," she said finally, each word measured and deliberate. "She lives quietly, under a different name, far from London and everything connected to her old life. She built that life carefully, your grace, out of the wreckage left behind after everything fell apart, and she guards it fiercely. I will not risk destroying what little peace she has found, simply because a duke has decided, after so many years, that he regrets the choices of his youth." I understand your caution, Edmund said. I would feel the same, in your position, but I am not asking you to destroy anything. I am asking only for the chance to explain the truth, and to let her decide for herself what she wishes to do with it. Charlotte was quiet for a long moment, her eyes moving between Edmund and Mrs. Pemberton, who had remained silent throughout the exchange, watching with the careful attention of someone who understood better than either of them how much weight this conversation carried. There is a key, Charlotte said finally, changing the subject with a suddenness that caught Edmund off guard. A small brass key. Eleanor mentioned it once, years ago, before we lost touch with the details of each other's daily lives the way sisters sometimes do when distance and hardship pull them apart. She said it opened a drawer in this very shop, one built into an old writing desk, and that whatever it unlocked mattered more to her than almost anything else she left behind. Edmund thought immediately of the writing desk in the back room, its drawer locked tight, resisting every attempt he had made to open it during his search through the shop's remaining furniture. I have found the desk, he said. The drawer is locked, and I have no key to open it. I may know where to find one, Charlotte said slowly, still weighing her own words with obvious care. Among our mother's belongings, which I have kept since her passing. I cannot promise it is the correct key, or that it still exists at all after so many years, but if you are willing to help me search for it, Your Grace, I am willing to consider whether you deserve the chance to prove your sincerity, before I decide whether to reveal my sister's whereabouts. Edmund felt something loosen in his chest for the first time since Mrs. Pemberton had first shown him into this shop days ago, a fragile thread of hope drawing tighter with each new piece of the puzzle falling into place. Then let us begin the search immediately, he said. I have already wasted enough years standing still. I have no intention of wasting a single day more. Charlotte hesitated, glancing toward the front window where the rain had begun again, softer this time, tapping quietly against the glass. Not today, she said. My belongings are not here, and I will not have you arriving at my home unannounced, however urgent you believe your business to be. My husband already knows little enough about my sister's past. I would prefer to prepare him before a duke appears on our doorstep asking questions about a family he has spent years trying to forget existed at all. Edmund forced himself to nod, though every instinct in him wanted to press further, to insist that time mattered more than propriety after everything he had already lost by waiting. But he understood, too, the wisdom in her caution. He had learned, over the past several days, that rushing forward without care had already cost this family more than he could ever fully repay. He would not compound that mistake by rushing now, when patience might still preserve whatever fragile trust Charlotte was only beginning to extend toward him. Then tell me when I may call, he said instead. I will wait as long as you require, but please, do not let that waiting stretch longer than it must. Charlotte studied him a moment longer, and something in her expression softened just slightly, as though his willingness to yield had earned him some small measure of credit he had not possessed when she first walked through the door. 2 days, she said finally. Come to my home in 2 days, and I will have spoken with my husband by then. I make no promises about what we will find among our mother's belongings, or whether the key even still exists. But I will look, Your Grace, for Eleanor's sake if nothing else. Thank you, Edmund said, and meant it more deeply than the simple words could properly convey. Charlotte gave him the address of her home, a modest street on the quieter edge of the city, and left soon after, her cloak still damp as she stepped back out into the rain. Edmund watched her go through the shop's front window and felt Mrs. Pemberton's presence settle beside him before she spoke. You handled that better than I expected, she said, a note of approval in her voice that Edmund had not heard from her before. I nearly did not, he admitted. Every part of me wanted to press her further, to demand she tell me everything at once. It took more restraint than I knew I possessed, to let her set the pace of this, instead of forcing my own urgency onto her. That restraint may be the very thing that earns you her trust, Mrs. Pemberton said. Charlotte strikes me as a woman who has spent years protecting her sister from further harm. She will not hand you access to Eleanor's life simply because you ask nicely. She will test you first, whether she says so plainly or not, and how you conduct yourself over these next 2 days will likely matter more than anything you have said to her today. Edmund considered her words carefully as he made his way home that evening, turning them over alongside everything else he had learned since first stepping through the bookshop's stubborn door. He thought of Eleanor's 2 letters, of the grief and quiet anger woven through every line, and understood now that finding her again would require more than good intentions alone. It would require proof, patience, and a willingness to let this family decide, in their own time, whether he deserved the chance to make amends at all. 2 days felt impossibly long, and yet Edmund forced himself to spend them productively rather than pacing the halls of his own home in restless anticipation. He returned to the bookshop each morning, continuing his search through old ledgers alongside Mrs. Pemberton, though he suspected now that whatever answers remained hidden in this building had already been found. The true answers, he understood, waited somewhere beyond these walls entirely, in a modest home on the quiet edge of the city, and in whatever small brass key Charlotte might or might not be able to find among her mother's keepsakes. He spent the second evening writing and rewriting a letter of his own, one he intended to give Charlotte for safekeeping, in case Eleanor refused to see him directly. A letter explaining everything he had not been given the chance to explain all those years ago. He filled page after page before finally settling on words that felt honest rather than desperate, humble rather than demanding, and when he finally sealed the finished letter, he felt something settle in his chest that had been absent for longer than he cared to admit. Whatever happened next, he had done everything within his power to make it right. Now all that remained was the waiting, and the hope that 2 days would be enough time for an old wound to begin, however slowly, however cautiously, the long process of healing. The door slammed shut before Edmund had even finished climbing the front steps. He stood there a moment, rain still clinging to his coat from the short walk from his carriage, staring at the closed door of the modest home Charlotte had directed him to 2 days earlier. Through the narrow window beside the entrance, he could hear raised voices inside, a man's voice sharp with anger, Charlotte's voice rising to match it. He had arrived, it seemed, in the middle of an argument he was almost certainly the cause of. He hesitated only a moment before knocking, firm and steady despite the uncertainty churning in his chest. The voices inside fell silent. A moment later the door opened again, and Charlotte stood there, her face flushed. Strands of dark hair escaped from their pins. Behind her, a tall man with a stern, weathered face stood near the hearth, his arms crossed tight over his chest, watching Edmund with open hostility. "Your Grace," Charlotte said, her voice carefully controlled despite the tension still visible in every line of her posture. "This is my husband, Henry Colton." "Mr. Colton," Edmund said, offering a small nod, though the man across the room made no move to return the greeting. "I told my wife this was a mistake," Henry said, his voice flat and hard. "I told her that dredging up her sister's past would bring nothing but trouble to this family. We have built a quiet life here, Your Grace, a respectable life. I will not have that life ruined because a duke has decided, after so many years, that his conscience requires soothing." Edmund stepped fully into the small parlor, removing his hat, choosing his words with care. "I understand your concern, Mr. Colton, truly, I do, but I am not here to bring scandal to your household. I am here because I owe Eleanor Whitfield a truth she was never given the chance to hear, and because I believe she deserves the choice of what to do with that truth, whatever consequences may follow." "Consequences," Henry repeated, a bitter edge in his voice. "It is easy for a man of your standing to speak so lightly of consequences, Your Grace. You have titles and estates to shield you from whatever gossip follows this visit. My wife and I have only our reputation, built carefully over years, and I will not watch it crumble because you have decided to indulge in a romantic notion from your youth." "Henry," Charlotte said quietly, a warning in her tone. "No," Edmund said, holding up a hand gently. "He is right to be cautious, Charlotte. Let him speak." Henry's eyes narrowed slightly, as though he had expected Edmund to argue rather than yield, and the small concession seemed to catch him off balance for a moment, before his expression hardened again. "What exactly do you intend to do, Your Grace, once you find my wife's sister? Do you intend to make some grand public declaration of your regret? Do you intend to drag her name through every drawing room in London, forcing her to relive whatever humiliation your family's actions already caused her once before?" "I intend nothing of the kind," Edmund said firmly. "I have spent years building a life of quiet distance from society's expectations, not because I sought solitude for its own sake, but because nothing in that life ever felt worth pursuing after I lost her. If Eleanor wishes for privacy, I will honor that wish completely, whatever it costs me. I am not asking to parade this truth before society. I am asking only for the chance to speak with her directly, in whatever manner she finds acceptable, and to let her decide the rest." The room fell quiet for a long moment. Charlotte glanced between her husband and Edmund, her expression torn between old loyalty and cautious hope. Henry's jaw remained tight, but something in his posture had shifted slightly, the rigid anger easing just a fraction as he studied Edmund with new, more careful attention. "You claim your intentions are honorable," Henry said finally, "but words are easily spoken, Your Grace. Actions carry far more weight." "Then let me prove it through action, rather than words," Edmund said. I am prepared to face whatever consequence this search brings, publicly or privately. I have already written a full account of everything that happened between Eleanor and myself all those years ago, sealed and ready to be delivered to her directly, so that even if she refuses to see me, she will finally know the truth rather than continuing to believe I abandoned her by choice. I am not asking either of you to shield me from scandal. I am asking only for the chance to make this right, whatever the cost to my own reputation. Henry studied him for a long moment, and Edmund could see the careful calculation happening behind the man's guarded eyes, weighing sincerity against years of protective instinct built up around a family that had already suffered enough at the hands of circumstances beyond their control. Finally, Henry uncrossed his arms and let out a slow breath. "You are either the most sincere man I have met in years, Your Grace, or the most convincing liar. I confess I am not yet certain which. Time will tell you which," Edmund said quietly. "I only ask for the chance to prove myself through what follows, rather than being judged entirely on what came before." Charlotte stepped forward then, glancing between the two men with visible relief that the tension in the room had finally begun to ease. "I have searched through Mother's belongings as I promised," she said, turning to Edmund. "It took the better part of yesterday evening, but I believe I found what we are looking for." She moved toward a small wooden chest sitting near the hearth, its surface worn smooth by years of handling, and lifted the lid carefully. Inside, nestled among folded fabric and a handful of old letters bound with faded string, lay a small brass key, its surface tarnished but its shape unmistakable. Delicate teeth cut in a pattern that matched, Edmund was certain, the lock on the writing desk drawer waiting back at the bookshop. "This was among Mother's most treasured belongings," Charlotte said, lifting the key carefully and turning it over in her palm. "She never told me what it opened. I assumed, for years, that it was simply a keepsake from happier times, something sentimental, with no real purpose left to serve. I did not think to ask further until you came asking about Eleanor's letters." Edmund stared at the small key, his heart beating faster at the sight of it. "May I take it? I believe it belongs to the drawer in the writing desk, the same desk where Eleanor once wrote her letters." Charlotte hesitated only a moment before closing her fingers around the key and holding it out toward him. "Take it," she said, "but I want to come with you when you open that drawer, Your Grace. Whatever is inside belonged to my sister, and I have as much right as you do to know what she left behind." "Of course," Edmund said immediately. "I would not dream of opening it without you." Henry watched this exchange with an expression that had softened considerably since Edmund first arrived, though caution still lingered behind his eyes. "I still have concerns about where this search may lead," he said, "but I will not stand in the way of my wife learning more about her own sister's past, however difficult that truth may prove to be." "Thank you," Edmund said, and meant it sincerely. "Both of you. I know how much trust this required, and I do not take it lightly." Charlotte fetched her cloak, and within the hour the two of them were seated together in Edmund's carriage, rattling through wet London streets toward the bookshop on Wren Lane, the small brass key held carefully in Charlotte's gloved hand. "I have not been inside that shop since we lost it," Charlotte admitted quietly, staring out the carriage window at streets grown unfamiliar over the years. "I was young when it happened, younger than Eleanor, and I do not remember the details as clearly as she must have, but I remember the sadness of it. The way our mother cried the night we signed the final papers, the way our father seemed to age 10 years in the span of a single season." "I am sorry," Edmund said quietly, "for whatever part my silence played in that sadness." Charlotte glanced at him, her expression unreadable for a long moment. "You could not have known the debts would follow so quickly." Eleanor herself did not fully understand the connection until much later, when she pieced together the timing on her own. "I do not say this to excuse you entirely, Your Grace, but I do not think you deserve the full weight of blame you seem determined to carry, either." Edmund said nothing in response, unsure how to accept even partial absolution for guilt he had carried so completely for so long. The carriage rattled on through the rain, and neither of them spoke again until Wren Lane came into view, the bookshop's crooked sign visible through the mist ahead. Mrs. Pemberton met them at the door, her expression brightening slightly at the sight of Charlotte beside Edmund, and led them without a word toward the small back room, where the locked writing desk still waited exactly as Edmund had left it days before. Charlotte's hands trembled slightly as she held the small brass key toward the drawer's lock. She glanced once at Edmund, as though seeking some final confirmation that she was ready for whatever truth waited inside, and then, taking a slow breath, she fit the key into the lock and turned it. The mechanism gave way with a soft click, and the drawer slid open at last, revealing whatever secrets Eleanor had left hidden away for so many patient, waiting years. Inside lay a small collection of items, arranged with the careful precision of someone who had known, even then, that whatever she placed here might not be found for a very long time. There was a pressed flower, its petals faded to a pale brown, but still holding the shape of the chestnut blossom Edmund remembered from the tree behind her father's shop. There was a small drawing, done in charcoal, of two figures standing beneath a stone archway wrapped in ivy, unmistakably the same garden where Edmund had found the second letter days before. And beneath both of these, folded once and sealed with a small circle of faded wax, lay a third letter, thicker than the two he had already found. Charlotte reached for the drawing first, her fingers hovering over the charcoal lines, as though afraid touching it might somehow damage the fragile memory it captured. "She drew this herself," Charlotte said softly. "I remember her sketching in the evenings, though she never showed anyone what she had drawn. I did not know it was you standing beside her in these pictures." Edmund studied the drawing over Charlotte's shoulder, his throat tight with an emotion he could not easily name. The two figures were drawn simply, without great detail, but something in the posture of them, the closeness of their shoulders, the way the taller figure seemed to lean slightly toward the smaller one, captured a tenderness that no amount of skill could have improved upon. "I remember that afternoon," he said quietly. "It was one of the last times we met there before everything changed. I did not know she was memorizing it so carefully, even then." Charlotte set the drawing aside gently and reached instead for the sealed letter, turning it over in her hands before glancing up at Edmund. "Will you read it here, or would you prefer privacy?" "Here," Edmund said, after a moment's consideration. "Whatever it says, I believe you have as much right to hear it as I do. This concerns your family as much as it concerns me." Charlotte broke the wax seal carefully and unfolded the pages, and together, standing close beside the old writing desk in the fading afternoon light, they read Eleanor's final hidden words. This letter, unlike the two that came before it, was not written in grief or anger, but in something closer to resignation, the voice of a young woman who had finally made peace, however painful, with a life that had turned out differently than she once hoped. She wrote of leaving London entirely, of building a new life far from the streets that held so many painful memories, of choosing a new name for herself so that whatever whispers had once followed her could never find her again. She wrote, too, of her family, of her mother's grief over losing the shop, of her father's declining health in the years that followed, and of Charlotte, still young enough then to be spared the full weight of what their family had lost. But it was the final paragraph that struck Edmund hardest, words written with a steadiness that suggested Eleanor had rehearsed them many times before committing them to paper. "If you are reading this," she had written, "then you have found your way further into my past than I ever expected anyone to travel. I do not know what led you here, or how much time has passed since I last saw your face. I have tried over the years to release myself from whatever hold you once held over my heart, and I believe, mostly, that I have succeeded. But some part of me, foolish as it may be, still wonders sometimes what might have happened if the world had allowed us the future we once imagined together, beneath that old chestnut tree. I do not ask you to find me. I only ask that whatever truth you have uncovered here brings you the same peace I have worked so hard to build for myself. If our paths were ever meant to cross again, I trust that fate will find its own way of arranging it, without either of us needing to force what was never truly within our control to begin with." Edmund lowered the page slowly, his hands unsteady, his chest aching with a grief so sharp it nearly stole the breath from his lungs entirely. Beside him, Charlotte remained quiet for a long moment, her own eyes bright with unshed tears as she studied her sister's careful, deliberate handwriting. "She sounds at peace," Charlotte said finally, her voice thick with emotion. "More at peace than I expected, given everything she must have carried these past years. She sounds like a woman who taught herself to survive without me," Edmund said quietly. "Which is exactly what she should have done, given how thoroughly I failed her." Charlotte turned to look at him fully then, something fierce and protective flashing behind her eyes despite the tears still gathered there. "Do not mistake her peace for indifference, Your Grace. A woman does not preserve a drawing of a stolen afternoon, or press a flower from a tree she can never return to, or write words this careful about fate and forgiveness, if she has truly stopped caring what became of the man she once loved. I know my sister. Whatever peace she has built, I do not believe it is as complete as these words suggest." Edmund looked down at the letter again, at the final line about fate arranging what neither of them could force alone, and felt something steady inside his chest, despite the ache still lingering there. "Then perhaps," he said slowly, "it is time fate had a little help finding its way." Charlotte studied him for a long moment, and then, for the first time since he had met her, something like a genuine smile touched the corners of her mouth. Perhaps it is, she agreed. I believe I know exactly where to find her, Your Grace. It is time you finally went looking. The carriage wheel struck a deep rut in the road and nearly threw Edmund from his seat entirely. He had been traveling since before dawn, the countryside rolling past in shades of green and gray, beneath a sky that could not decide whether to rain or clear, and every mile that passed only sharpened the restless urgency building in his chest. Charlotte sat across from him, her expression composed despite the rough road, occasionally glancing out the window as though checking the passing landmarks against some memory of her own. "How much farther?" Edmund asked, not for the first time that morning. "Patience, Your Grace," Charlotte said, though there was a small smile tugging at the corner of her mouth now, softer than the guarded suspicion she had shown him days earlier. "We will arrive when we arrive. Rushing the horses will not make the village appear any sooner." Edmund forced himself to sit back against the seat, though his hands remained restless in his lap, turning over and over the small drawing Eleanor had left behind, the one Charlotte had insisted he bring along, saying it might help remind her sister of gentler days before whatever difficult conversation waited ahead. Charlotte had spent the 2 days since finding the letter in the writing desk making careful arrangements. She had written first to a cousin who lived near the village where Eleanor had settled years ago, confirming through careful, indirect questions that her sister still lived there under the name she had chosen for herself, working as a seamstress, and keeping largely to herself except for a small circle of trusted friends. Charlotte had not written to Eleanor directly, unwilling to risk her sister fleeing further into hiding if she learned too soon that her past had finally caught up with her. "I still do not know exactly what I will say to her," Edmund admitted, watching the countryside roll past the window. "I have rehearsed 100 different speeches over these past 2 days, and none of them feel adequate to everything I need to explain." "Perhaps that is because no speech could ever be adequate," Ashlett said thoughtfully. "Perhaps the best thing you can do is simply tell her the truth, plainly and without rehearsal, and trust her enough to handle whatever reaction that truth brings." Edmund considered her words carefully as the carriage continued its journey. He thought of his father, dead these 6 years now, and of the choices that man had forced upon him at an age when Edmund had not yet learned how to stand firm against expectations that threatened to crush everything he actually wanted from his life. He thought, too, of the years since, the careful, orderly existence he had built for himself, filled with obligation and duty, but empty of the one thing that had ever made him feel truly alive. He had told himself for years that this emptiness was simply the price of his position, that a man born to his responsibilities could not expect the same freedoms as men born to lesser stations. But sitting here now, closer than he had been in years to finally seeing Eleanor's face again, he understood how much of that belief had simply been a shield, a convenient excuse that let him avoid confronting how badly he had failed to fight for what mattered most. The village came into view shortly after midday, a small collection of stone cottages scattered along a winding road, smoke rising from chimneys into a sky that had finally decided to clear. Charlotte directed the driver toward a modest house on the edge of the village, its front garden neatly kept despite the season, curtains drawn against the afternoon light. "This is her cousin's home," Charlotte explained as the carriage rolled to a stop. "Eleanor lives nearby, in a small cottage just beyond the church. But I thought it wise to stop here first, to confirm she is still in residence before we simply appear at her door unannounced." Edmund nodded, though every fiber of his being wanted to walk directly to Eleanor's cottage without further delay. He forced himself to wait in the carriage while Charlotte went to knock on her cousin's door, watching through the window as the two women exchanged quiet words on the front step, Charlotte's cousin glancing occasionally toward the carriage with open curiosity. When Charlotte finally returned, her expression carried a mixture of relief and apprehension that made Edmund's chest tighten further. "She is still here," Charlotte confirmed, climbing back into the carriage. "My cousin says she has grown well respected in the village these past years, known for fine needlework and a quiet, steady temperament. She has kept largely to herself where matters of the heart are concerned, according to my cousin, though there was apparently a local merchant who courted her briefly last year without success." Something tightened uncomfortably in Edmund's chest at the mention of another man, though he had no right, he reminded himself, to feel anything close to jealousy after everything his silence had already cost her. "Shall we go to her directly?" he asked. Charlotte hesitated, studying him carefully. "I think, perhaps, it would be wiser for me to go first, alone. She has not seen me in some years, Your Grace, and even that reunion alone will carry weight enough without a duke appearing at her door in the same breath. Let me speak with her first, prepare her for what follows, and then I will send for you." Edmund wanted desperately to argue, every instinct urging him toward Eleanor's door without further delay, But he forced himself to remember Mrs. Pemberton's earlier warning and Charlotte's own careful patience throughout this entire search, and understood that rushing forward now, after everything, might undo the fragile trust that had brought him this far. "Very well," he said finally. "I will wait here. But please, Charlotte, do not make me wait longer than necessary. I have already waited years for this chance. I do not think I can bear waiting much longer now that I am finally so close." Charlotte studied him a moment longer, something gentle passing behind her eyes, and then she nodded and stepped back out of the carriage, making her way down the winding road toward the small church visible in the distance, and the cottage that waited somewhere beyond it. The waiting proved harder than Edmund had anticipated. He paced the small stretch of road beside the carriage, watched the afternoon light shift slowly across the village rooftops, and tried to imagine every possible version of the conversation happening somewhere out of his sight. He imagined Eleanor's shock at learning her sister had appeared unannounced after years of separation. He imagined her fear, or perhaps her anger, upon learning that Edmund himself waited nearby, ready to finally explain the truth she had waited so long to hear. An hour passed, then another, the afternoon light beginning its slow slide toward evening, and still Charlotte did not return. Edmund's anxiety grew with every passing minute, dark possibilities crowding his thoughts. Perhaps Eleanor had refused to see her sister at all. Perhaps the years of separation had grown into something too wide to bridge with a single afternoon's conversation. Perhaps, worst of all, Eleanor had already guessed the reason for her sister's sudden visit and had fled the village entirely, rather than face a reckoning she had spent years avoiding. He was on the verge of abandoning patience entirely and walking toward the church himself, when he finally saw Charlotte's figure appear on the winding road, walking quickly, her expression difficult to read from this distance. Edmund met her halfway, his heart pounding with a mixture of hope and dread. "Well?" he asked, unable to wait even the few remaining steps for her to reach him properly. "What did she say? Will she see me?" Charlotte's expression softened slightly, though there was caution still visible behind her eyes. She was shocked at first, to see me standing at her door after so many years apart. We spoke for a long while, catching up on all the time we had lost, before I finally found the courage to mention why I had truly come. "And?" Edmund pressed, hardly daring to breathe. "She grew very quiet when I told her a duke had purchased the old bookshop and had found her letters hidden inside," Charlotte said carefully. "She did not speak for a long moment, and I confess I feared she might ask me to leave entirely rather than continue the conversation. But then she asked me a question I did not expect." "What question?" Charlotte met his eyes directly. "She asked whether you seemed sincere, or whether this was simply some passing curiosity that would fade once the novelty of rediscovering old letters wore thin. I told her truthfully that I had never seen a man work so hard, or risk so much, chasing after a truth that offered him no guaranteed reward at the end of it." Edmund's chest tightened with something between hope and terror. "And what did she say to that?" "She did not answer directly," Charlotte admitted. "But she did not ask me to leave either. She asked instead whether you were nearby. When I told her you were waiting just beyond the village, she grew very still, and then she asked me to bring you to her cottage, though she gave no promise of what might happen once you arrived." Edmund felt something between relief and terror surge through his chest all at once. After years of searching, after letters found in broken panels and old gardens and locked writing desks, after every careful, patient step that had brought him this far, he was finally about to stand before Eleanor Whitfield again. "Take me to her," he said, his voice steadier than he felt. "Please, Charlotte, I am ready." Charlotte studied him a long moment, something like sympathy softening her expression. "She may not welcome you as warmly as you hope, Your Grace. Years of hurt do not simply vanish because the truth has finally arrived. Be prepared for that, whatever happens next." "I am prepared," Edmund said, though even as he spoke the words, he understood how little preparation could truly matter in a moment like this one. "I have spent years imagining this reunion. Whatever form it actually takes, I intend to face it honestly, without flinching, and let whatever happens next unfold exactly as it must." Charlotte nodded once, satisfied, and together they began the walk toward the small church at the edge of the village, and the cottage that waited somewhere beyond it, where Eleanor Whitfield, after so many years of careful hiding, had finally agreed to let her past find its way back to her door. The road wound gently past low stone walls and fields turning gold in the fading afternoon light, and with every step Edmund felt years of careful distance falling away from him, replaced by something raw and unguarded that he had not allowed himself to feel in longer than he could properly remember. Whatever waited at the end of this road, he understood now that he had already made his choice. He would not turn back, not now, Not after everything it had taken to arrive at this single, trembling moment. As they walked, Charlotte spoke quietly of the years since the family had lost the shop, filling in gaps that Eleanor's letters had left untouched. She told him of their father's final months, weakened by worry more than any illness a physician could properly name, and of the quiet dignity with which he had faced the end, despite everything the family had lost. She told him, too, of their mother's slow recovery from grief, how the older woman had eventually found some measure of peace in Charlotte's own small household, spending her final years surrounded by grandchildren who never knew the shop on Wren Lane had ever existed at all. "I did not know any of this," Edmund admitted quietly, listening to each detail with a growing weight settling over his chest. "I searched for your family after my father's arranged match collapsed, but by then, you had already vanished so completely that I found no trace of where any of you had gone." "We changed our name," Charlotte explained. "Not officially, not in any way a solicitor's search would easily uncover, but enough to make ourselves harder to find. My mother insisted on it, actually, more than Eleanor did. She said the Whitfield name had become too heavy a thing to carry through London society after the shop failed, too tangled up with pity and whispered gossip for any of us to bear comfortably. Eleanor took a different name still, once she left to build her own life separate from the rest of us. I do not think she ever expected anyone to come looking hard enough to find her." Edmund absorbed this information slowly, understanding now how thoroughly his search all those years ago had been doomed from the very beginning. He had searched under a name that no longer existed, for a family that had scattered and hidden itself precisely to avoid the kind of attention his own inquiries would have brought. It was, he realized with a bitter kind of clarity, almost a miracle that any thread had ever survived long enough to lead him here at all, more than a decade later, walking toward a cottage at the edge of a quiet village he had never before had reason to visit. "Does she know," Edmund asked carefully, "that I searched for her at all? Or does she still believe I simply let her go without any effort to find her again?" Charlotte considered the question for a long moment before answering. "I told her what you told me, that you searched after your father's match fell apart, that you found nothing because our family had already vanished so completely. I do not know if she fully believes it yet. Belief takes time to rebuild, Your Grace, especially after years spent convincing oneself of a very different story, simply to survive the pain of it." Edmund nodded, understanding the truth of her words even as they settled uncomfortably in his chest. He had spent his own years constructing a story of quiet, dignified grief, telling himself he had done everything possible to find her, when in truth he now understood how easily his search could have failed regardless of his sincerity, simply because the world had conspired, through circumstance and grief, and a family's understandable need to hide from painful memories, to keep them apart no matter how hard either of them might have tried to close the distance. They reached the small stone church at the edge of the village as the afternoon light began its slow deepening toward evening, gold turning gradually to amber across the surrounding fields. Charlotte paused there a moment, glancing toward a narrow path that continued beyond the churchyard, winding between low hedges toward a cottage Edmund could just make out in the distance, smoke rising thin and steady from its chimney. "That is her home," Charlotte said quietly, "just beyond that final bend in the path." Edmund felt his heart quicken at the sight of it, small and modest, nothing like the grand estates that filled the rest of his daily life, and yet somehow more significant to him in this moment than any building he had ever stood before. Somewhere inside those stone walls, a woman he had loved and lost and searched for, across more years than he cared to count, was waiting, uncertain, perhaps frightened, perhaps still guarded against whatever pain his sudden reappearance might bring. "I think," Charlotte said carefully, watching his face, "that I should let you walk the rest of the way alone. Whatever happens between the two of you now belongs to you both, and I do not think either of you needs an audience for it." Edmund turned to her, gratitude swelling alongside the anxiety already churning through his chest. "Thank you, Charlotte, for all of it. I know how much courage it took to trust me this far, and I will not forget it." Charlotte offered him a small, genuine smile, the guardedness that had defined their first meeting entirely absent now. "Do not thank me yet, Your Grace. Save your gratitude for whatever happens next, and let us hope, for both your sakes, that it proves worth the years it took to arrive here." She turned and made her way toward her cousin's home, leaving Edmund alone at the edge of the churchyard, the narrow path stretching out before him toward the cottage where Eleanor waited. He stood there a long moment, gathering whatever courage remained to him after so long a journey, and then, taking a slow breath, he began to walk. Every step along that narrow path felt heavier than the last, each one carrying the weight of years spent apart, of letters hidden behind broken panels and buried beneath ivy-covered stones, of grief carefully buried and now, finally, unearthed completely. The cottage grew larger with every step, its windows catching the last warm light of the day, until at last Edmund stood before its modest wooden door, his hand raised, hesitating only a moment before he finally knocked. The door opened before Edmund's knuckles had even finished their second knock. Eleanor stood in the doorway, and for a long moment neither of them spoke at all, the years between them collapsing into a single suspended breath. She looked older than the memory he had carried for so long, lines at the corners of her eyes that had not been there before, her dark hair pinned more simply than he remembered, streaked now with the faintest threads of gray. But her eyes were unmistakably hers, sharp and searching, fixed on his face with an intensity that made his chest ache with a grief and hope so tangled together he could not separate one from the other. "Edmund," she said finally, his name unfamiliar on her lips after so many years of silence between them, though something in the way she said it suggested she had never entirely stopped remembering how it sounded. "Eleanor," he answered, his voice rougher than he intended. "I have searched for you for so many years. I did not think I would ever stand before you again." She did not step aside to let him enter. She simply stood there, one hand still resting on the edge of the door, studying him with an expression he could not fully read, caution and disbelief, and something else beneath both of those things that he dared not name yet, for fear of being wrong. "Charlotte told me you found the letters," she said finally. "I did not think anyone ever would. I hid them so carefully. I convinced myself, over the years, that they would simply remain hidden forever, forgotten along with everything else from that part of my life." "I found them," Edmund confirmed. "All three. The one behind the panel in the shop, the one in the garden by the old chapel, and the one in the writing desk drawer, alongside your drawing and the pressed flower. I have read every word, Eleanor, more times than I can count." Something flickered across her face at the mention of the drawing, a vulnerability she quickly tried to mask, though not quickly enough to hide it from him entirely. "Then you know everything," she said quietly. "Everything I never had the courage to say to your face, all those years ago, when courage might have actually mattered. I know what I should have told you myself, years before you ever needed to write it down at all," Edmund said. "I know that my silence cost you far more than I ever understood, and that no apology I offer now can undo the years you spent believing I had simply abandoned you by choice." Eleanor's composure wavered slightly, her hand tightening against the doorframe. "You did abandon me, Edmund. Whatever forced your hand, whatever pressure your father placed upon you, the result was the same either way. I was left alone, without explanation, to watch my family lose everything we had built, while you disappeared into a life I was never permitted to be part of." "You are right," Edmund said, refusing to flinch from the truth of her words, though they struck deeper than almost anything else she could have said. "I cannot argue with the result, whatever my intentions were at the time. I was young, and afraid, and I let my father's fury silence me, rather than finding some way, any way, to reach you and explain what was happening. I have regretted that silence every day since, but regret does not undo the years it cost you. I understand if that regret means nothing to you now." Eleanor studied him for a long moment, something shifting behind her eyes, and finally, slowly, she stepped back from the doorway, allowing him room to enter. "Come in," she said quietly. "Whatever this conversation becomes, I do not think it should happen on my doorstep, in front of half the village." Edmund stepped inside, and found himself standing in a small, warmly furnished room, simple but comfortable, evidence of the careful, steady life Eleanor had built for herself scattered throughout. A basket of half-finished needlework sat near the window, catching the last of the afternoon light. Books lined a low shelf near the hearth, some of them, he noticed with a pang, titles he recognized from her father's old shop. "Your life looks peaceful," he said, unable to keep a note of something like sorrow from his voice. "I am glad of that, at least. Whatever else has happened, I am glad you found some measure of peace after everything you lost." "It took years to build," Eleanor said, gesturing for him to sit near the small hearth while she remained standing, arms crossed protectively over her chest. "Years of convincing myself that the life I imagined with you belonged to someone else entirely, a younger, more foolish version of myself who did not yet understand how easily the world could take everything away." "I am sorry," Edmund said again, the words feeling inadequate even as he spoke them. "I know sorry cannot repair what was broken, but it is the truest thing I have to offer you, alongside everything else I have already given. The letters, the search, the years spent trying to understand what happened to you after you vanished from my life." Eleanor was quiet for a long moment, studying the fire rather than meeting his eyes. "Charlotte told me you refused to hide your search, even when doing so risked scandal. She told me you were prepared to face whatever consequence came from seeking me out, publicly if necessary. I was, Edmund confirmed. I am still prepared for that, whatever you decide. I did not come here to ask you to return to London or to resume some life you have long since moved beyond. I came only to give you the truth I owed you all those years ago and to let you decide what to do with it, free from whatever misunderstanding kept us apart for so long. Eleanor finally looked at him directly, and Edmund saw, beneath the careful composure she had maintained since opening the door, a grief so raw and long buried that it nearly undid him entirely. I spent years hating you, she said quietly, her voice trembling slightly despite her obvious effort to keep it steady. Not always. Sometimes I simply missed you, the way one misses a limb long after it has been lost. But often, especially in the early years, I hated you fiercely. Because hating you felt easier than grieving you, and because believing you had chosen someone else, some family of greater standing, was somehow less painful than imagining you had simply been powerless to stop what happened to us. I understand, Edmund said softly. I would likely have felt the same, in your position. But I never stopped wondering, Eleanor continued, her composure finally beginning to crack, tears gathering at the corners of her eyes despite her obvious effort to hold them back. Even after I told myself I had moved past you entirely, even after I built this life, this peace I have worked so hard to maintain, some small part of me never stopped wondering what really happened, whether you thought of me at all, whether any part of what we shared had been real to you, the way it had been real to me. Every part of it was real, Edmund said, rising from his seat and crossing the small room toward her, though he stopped short of reaching for her, uncertain whether such a gesture would be welcome. I have thought of you every day since we were separated, Eleanor. I built a life of quiet distance from everyone else precisely because nothing else ever felt as real as what we shared beneath that chestnut tree, in that garden, in every stolen hour we managed to find together before the world tore us apart. Eleanor's tears finally spilled over, and she pressed a trembling hand against her mouth, years of carefully guarded grief breaking free all at once. Edmund stood close beside her, uncertain what comfort he had any right to offer, until finally she reached out herself, closing the small distance between them, and let him hold her while years of unspoken sorrow finally found their release. They stood like that for a long while, neither of them speaking, the fire crackling softly beside them as the last light of afternoon deepened toward evening outside the small cottage windows. When Eleanor finally stepped back, her face still wet with tears but her expression somehow lighter than it had been since he arrived, she looked at him with something that had not been present in her eyes before. I do not know what happens now, she said quietly. Too much time has passed for us to simply pretend the years apart never happened. I am not the same woman you once loved beneath that tree, Edmund. I have built an entire life you know nothing about. Friendships and habits and a quiet independence I am not certain I am willing to give up, even for you. I am not asking you to give up anything, Edmund said gently. I am not asking you to become the woman you were before any of this happened. I am only asking for the chance to know the woman you have become, however long that takes, and whatever shape it eventually leads to, if it leads anywhere at all. Eleanor studied him a long moment, something like the ghost of a smile finally touching the corners of her mouth. You always were more patient than I gave you credit for in the end. Perhaps that patience is exactly what both of us need now, after everything. Then let us begin there, Edmund said, with patience, and with truth, and with whatever time you are willing to give me to prove that the years apart have not changed what I feel, even if they have changed everything else around us. Eleanor reached up and wiped the last of her tears away, and for the first time since he had arrived at her door, something like real hope settled steadily into her expression. There is a bookshop, I am told, that has recently reopened on Wren Lane, she said, a faint teasing note entering her voice, despite everything they had just shared. Perhaps, once I have had time to consider all of this properly, you might show me what has become of it. Whenever you are ready, Edmund said, warmth spreading through his chest for the first time in longer than he could remember. I will wait as long as you need. I have already proven, I think, that I know how to wait. Eleanor laughed softly, a small surprise sound, as though she had forgotten she still remembered how. Yes, she agreed. I believe you have proven that very well indeed. They sat together by the fire a while longer, and slowly, carefully, the conversation began to shift away from grief and toward something gentler, something closer to the easy familiarity they had once shared before the world intervened. Eleanor asked him, hesitantly at first, about the years since they had parted, about the estates he managed and the quiet, solitary habits he had built for himself in her absence, Edmund found himself answering honestly, without the careful guardedness he usually reserved for conversations about his own life, describing the emptiness of those years with a frankness that surprised even himself. In turn, she told him of her own years, of the small triumphs and quiet disappointments that had shaped the life she built for herself, of the friendships she had formed in the village, careful and slow to trust at first, but real and steady now after so many years of cultivation. She told him of the merchant who had courted her briefly, and of how she had turned him away not out of any lingering attachment to a man she believed lost to her forever, but simply because something in her had never quite been ready to open that part of her heart again to anyone at all. "I told myself it was simply caution," she admitted, staring into the fire rather than at him, "that I had learned my lesson about trusting my heart to circumstances beyond my control. But I wonder now whether some part of me was always waiting, even when I insisted to myself that I had stopped." Edmund said nothing to that, uncertain any words of his could properly honor what she had just admitted, and instead simply reached for her hand, resting on the small table between them, and found that she did not pull away. They talked long into the evening, until the fire burned low, and the small cottage windows had gone entirely dark against the night outside. Edmund knew he could not stay, that propriety and Eleanor's own careful independence required he take his leave and return to the village inn where Charlotte had already arranged rooms for the both of them, but he found himself reluctant to end the evening, unwilling to let even a few hours of separation interrupt what had finally begun to mend between them. "You should go," Eleanor said eventually, though there was no real urgency in her voice, only a gentle practicality. "It grows late, and I imagine Charlotte is wondering what has become of you." "I imagine she is," Edmund agreed, though he made no immediate move to rise. "May I call on you again tomorrow? I do not wish to overstay whatever welcome you have extended me tonight, but I find I am not yet ready to let this conversation end entirely." Eleanor considered the question for a long moment, and Edmund watched something settle behind her eyes, a decision reached after years of careful guardedness finally beginning to soften. "Yes," she said finally. "Come tomorrow, and the day after, if you wish it. I think perhaps we have both waited long enough for this conversation to happen all at once. Perhaps it deserves to unfold slowly instead, the way it might have unfolded all those years ago, if the world had simply allowed us the chance." Edmund rose then, reluctant but understanding, and made his way to the door, Eleanor following close behind him. At the threshold he paused, turning back to face her one final time before stepping out into the cool evening air. "Thank you," he said quietly, "for letting me in tonight, for hearing me, even after everything. I know it cost you something, and I do not take that lightly. Thank you for finding the courage to come at all," Eleanor said softly. "I do not think I would have found the courage to seek you out myself, even after everything Charlotte told me. Some part of me needed you to be the one to cross that distance first, after everything." Edmund nodded, understanding the weight behind her words, and stepped out into the quiet evening, the door closing gently behind him. He walked back toward the village inn beneath a sky scattered with stars, his chest lighter than it had been in years. Hope kindled steadily, where only grief and quiet resignation had lived for so long. Outside, the last light of day settled gently over the quiet village, gold fading slowly into the soft blue of evening, and inside the small cottage, two people who had spent years apart, separated by silence and misunderstanding, and circumstances neither of them had fully controlled, finally allowed themselves to imagine, cautiously, tentatively, what a future together might actually look like. Weeks later, when Eleanor finally traveled back to London to see the bookshop for herself, she found it transformed. The shelves had been repaired, the broken panel in the back room replaced, the old writing desk restored and polished until it gleamed beneath the afternoon light streaming through newly cleaned windows. Mrs. Pemberton greeted her at the door with tears in her eyes, and Charlotte, who had never stopped believing this reunion might someday be possible, stood waiting just inside, ready to welcome her sister back into a life neither of them had ever expected to share again. The shop that had once held so much loss now held something entirely different, a beginning neither Edmund nor Eleanor had dared to hope for during all those years apart, built patiently, truthfully, from the fragile threads of letters that had waited faithfully, through storm and silence and years of quiet grief, for exactly this moment to finally arrive. 6 months after Eleanor first walked back through the doors of the bookshop on Wren Lane, a letter arrived at the cottage that nearly undid everything the two of them had so carefully rebuilt. It came from a distant cousin of Edmund's late father, a woman named Cordelia Ashworth Vane, who had somehow learned of the Duke's renewed attachment to a woman with no title and a scandal buried in her past. The letter was polite in tone but unmistakable in its purpose, warning Edmund that certain members of the family intended to raise formal objections should he pursue marriage with a woman so far beneath his station, and reminding him of obligations to family name and legacy that his father had always held above every other consideration. Edmund read the letter twice before setting it down on his study desk, his jaw tight with an anger he had not felt in years. He had grown accustomed, these past months, to a kind of quiet happiness he had almost forgotten was possible, splitting his time between his London estates and the small village where Eleanor still lived, slowly, patiently building trust between them one visit at a time. He had not expected that happiness to be threatened quite so soon, or quite so directly, by the same kind of family pressure that had cost him Eleanor once already. He traveled to the village the very next day, the letter folded in his coat pocket, uncertain whether to share it with Eleanor at all or simply handle the matter privately, the way he had handled so much of his family's disapproval in the years since his father's death. But he had promised her honesty, above everything else, and he found he could not bring himself to break that promise now, however uncomfortable the truth might prove. Eleanor read the letter in silence, her expression unreadable, and when she finally looked up at him, Edmund braced himself for fear, or perhaps resignation, the same quiet acceptance of defeat that had once driven her from London entirely, rather than face a family's disapproval. Instead, she simply folded the letter closed and handed it back to him. "What do you intend to do about this?" she asked, her voice steady and calm. "I intend to ignore it," Edmund said firmly. "I built a life away from my family's expectations once already, Eleanor. I have no intention of allowing a distant cousin's letter to undo everything we have worked to rebuild between us. If my family wishes to raise objections, they may do so publicly, and I will answer them publicly, with the same honesty I have shown you from the very beginning." Eleanor studied him for a long moment, something steady and sure settling behind her eyes. "You are not the same man who let his father's fury silence him all those years ago." "No," Edmund agreed. "I am not. I learned, at great cost, exactly what silence costs the people I love most. I do not intend to repeat that mistake, whatever pressure my family chooses to apply." Eleanor reached for his hand then, her fingers steady against his own. "Then let them object," she said simply. "I have already survived losing everything once. I am not afraid of losing a family's approval I never sought in the first place." Word of Cordelia's letter spread quietly through certain circles of London society over the following weeks, and with it came exactly the kind of whispered scandal Henry Colton had once feared so deeply. Edmund faced it directly, just as he had promised, declining to hide either his intentions or his history with Eleanor whenever the subject arose in company. He spoke of her plainly, honestly, refusing to treat their attachment as something shameful to be concealed, and slowly, gradually, the whispers began to shift from scandal toward something closer to grudging respect for a duke willing to risk his own standing for a love he refused to abandon a second time. Charlotte and Henry proved unexpectedly steady allies throughout this period, Henry's early caution having transformed, somewhere along the months of watching Edmund's persistent sincerity, into something like genuine loyalty. He accompanied Edmund to several difficult conversations with family members and old acquaintances, offering the kind of blunt, practical support that helped steady Edmund's resolve whenever old doubts threatened to creep back in. Mrs. Pemberton, too, remained a constant presence throughout these months, continuing to manage the daily operations of the reopened bookshop, even as Edmund and Eleanor's attention turned increasingly toward matters beyond its walls. She had taken to referring to the shop, in conversations with regular customers, as the place where an old story had finally found its proper ending, though she never explained the remark further to anyone curious enough to ask. By early spring, nearly a year after Edmund first pushed open the stubborn door of that forgotten bookshop, he and Eleanor were married, in a quiet ceremony attended by only their closest connections. Charlotte stood beside her sister as witness, tears streaming freely down her face throughout the entire service. Mrs. Pemberton sat in the front row, dressed in her finest shawl, dabbing at her eyes with a handkerchief she had clearly brought prepared for exactly this purpose. Even Henry, standing stiffly beside his wife, could not entirely hide the emotion visible in his expression as he watched the ceremony unfold. There was no grand society wedding, no elaborate celebration meant to announce their union to all of London at once. Edmund and Eleanor had both agreed, without much discussion needed, that such spectacle held little appeal after everything quiet, patient truth had already cost and given them both. They wanted only the people who had helped them find their way back to each other, gathered together in the small garden behind the old chapel, where Edmund had once found the second of Eleanor's hidden letters. ivy still climbing thick and green across the familiar stone archway above them. After the ceremony, as the small gathering shared a simple meal beneath the garden's spreading trees, Eleanor drew Edmund aside for a quiet moment, away from the warmth of their gathered friends and family. "Do you remember," she asked softly, "the first time we sat beneath this archway together, all those years ago, before everything fell apart?" "I remember every moment of it," Edmund said. "I have carried that memory through every year we spent apart, even when I told myself I had no right to hold on to it any longer." Eleanor smiled, reaching up to touch the edge of the stone where their initials, still faintly visible, despite the years of weather, remained carved into the soft rock. "I used to believe this place held only sorrow for me. Every time I thought of it, I remembered only what we lost here, the promises that were broken, the future that never came to pass the way we once imagined it." "And now?" Edmund asked. "Now I think perhaps this place was simply waiting," Eleanor said, "the same way those letters waited, patient and hidden, for exactly the right moment to be found again. I do not think our story ended the day you stopped calling, Edmund. I think it simply paused, longer and more painfully than either of us ever wanted, before finding its way back to precisely where it always belonged." Edmund pulled her close, the warmth of the spring afternoon settling comfortably around them both, the sounds of their small gathering carrying softly from beyond the garden's low stone walls. "Then let us make certain," he said quietly, "that whatever chapters come next, we write them together, honestly, without ever again allowing silence to separate us from each other." Eleanor rested her head against his shoulder, watching the ivy sway gently in the afternoon breeze above the old stone archway that had witnessed both the beginning and, now, the true continuation of their story. "Together," she agreed softly. "However long we are given, and whatever comes next, together." The bookshop on Wren Lane remained open for many years afterward, its shelves filled once again with the same careful attention the Whitfield family had once given it, its backroom home to a writing desk where, on quiet afternoons, Eleanor still sometimes sat and wrote, though now her letters were never hidden, never meant to wait years for someone patient enough to find them. Mrs. Pemberton stayed on as long as her health allowed, delighting for the rest of her days in telling curious customers fragments of the story behind the shop's crooked, faded sign, though she always left the fullest details for Edmund and Eleanor themselves to share, whenever they felt the story was truly theirs to tell. And on quiet evenings, when the shop had closed for the day, and the London streets outside had grown gentle with lamplight, Edmund would often find Eleanor standing near that small back room, one hand resting against the old writing desk, remembering, perhaps, everything it had once held hidden, and everything it had finally, faithfully, helped bring home. In the years that followed, Charlotte and Henry became frequent visitors to the shop, their own children growing up half convinced that some quiet magic lived within its crowded shelves, since their aunt and uncle so often spoke of it as the place where an entire family's fortunes had somehow turned around. Henry in particular grew fond of spending his afternoons there whenever business brought him into the city, settling into the same cracked leather chair Edmund had first noticed on the stormy night he pushed open the shop's stubborn door, losing himself for hours in whatever volume caught his interest that day. Eleanor never fully returned to using her birth name in public, choosing instead to blend the life she had built for herself with the one she had finally reclaimed, introducing herself in most companies simply as the Duchess, and reserving the fuller truth of her history for those she trusted enough to hear it properly. Edmund never once asked her to change this arrangement, understanding that the name she had chosen for herself during her years of hiding had also, in its own quiet way, saved her, given her the strength and independence she needed to survive long enough for their story to find its way back together at all. Word of their unusual courtship, a duke who had found his lost love through letters hidden in a forgotten bookshop, eventually became something of a quiet legend among those who frequented Wren Lane, though neither Edmund nor Eleanor ever encouraged the retelling of it beyond what felt comfortable to share. They preferred, instead, to let the shop itself stand as the truest record of everything that had happened, its shelves and desks and quiet corners holding memory in a way that no spoken retelling could ever quite manage to capture. Mrs. Pemberton lived long enough to see their first child born, a daughter with her mother's sharp, searching eyes and her father's steady patience, and she declared, holding the infant in her arms for the first time, that the shop had finally completed the story it had been waiting so many years to tell. She passed peacefully not long after, in the small room above the shop she had called home for most of her life, surrounded by the family she had helped bring back together, and Edmund and Eleanor made certain her memory remained honored within the shop for as long as it continued to stand. Years later, when their own children were old enough to ask about the strange, wonderful story of how their parents had found each other again after so many years apart, Edmund and Eleanor would sit together in that same small back room, the old writing desk between them, and tell the story exactly as it had happened, without embellishment, without hiding any of the pain or the patience it had taken to arrive at their happiness. They wanted their children to understand, above all else, that love left too long in silence could grow into grief, but that even grief, given enough patience and enough courage to finally speak the truth aloud, could still find its way home again. The chestnut tree behind the old chapel garden continued to bloom each spring, its blossoms falling soft and pale across the stone archway where two young lovers had once carved their initials into the rock, believing themselves hidden from a world that would eventually, however painfully, however slowly, allow them to find their way back to exactly where they had always belonged.